am a professional artist who decided 2 years ago to pursue a master's degree in conflict and dispute resolution. Through my artwork, I record emotional responses to the process of bereavement by creating collages and book structures. Accustomed to the natural way many artists reflect emotional responses through artwork, I was confused and saddened working with my cohort and my mediation clients at the lack of expressed and unacknowledged loss during conflict, and also how this element often entrenches conflicts into deeper stalemates. I began to ask, what can conflict specialists learn from artists about grief and mourning? This project specifically illustrates how some artists express grief, mourning, trauma, conflict, and loss through their work. Along with my thesis terminal paper, I have created a companion collection of original artwork that attempts to explore the creative process within this context. There are 3 foundational concepts for this body of work: what makes creativity, and within that, the practice of open, closed thinking, grief, mourning, and vicarious resilience. According to creativity expert Keith Symington from the University of California, rather than a high level of intelligence, the largest required component for creativity is the potential for diverse experiences that weaken the constructs imposed by conventional socialization. Creativity is spurred on by creating solutions to obstacles. Therefore, conflict situations by their very nature can invite creative behavior and expression. Also, Professor Donald McKinnon from the University of California states the most creative people move in a way of operating which allowed their natural creativity to function. Creativity becomes a way of choosing to operate and thinking. While writing a book together, comedian John Cleese and psychiatrist and psychotherapist Dr. Robin Skyner incorporated this creativity research to support a new process they called open and closed mode thinking. Open mode can be described as relaxed, expansive, playful, and humorous, while the closed mode, often a standard workplace norm, is active, impatient, focused, purposeful, and without much humor. At times can be on the verge of tension, stress, and anxiety. While in practical terms, both the open and closed mode must be used efficiently to produce innovation. Creativity is not possible in closed mode, while the implementation of a creative idea is also not possible in open mode. Creative people fluidly cycle between both open and closed mode thinking. Grief and mourning are often confused or used interchangeably. Grief is the internal feelings of loss, while mourning is the outward expression of internal grief. Grief can arise from any change in a normal pattern and is the normal, natural, and painful emotional reactions to loss or change of any kind. There are many losses a person can experience over the course of a lifetime. Some examples include a death, a move, an illness or disability, a divorce, retirement, a job loss, or a loss of some aspect of self or identity. Because of the way grief is internally processed in the brain, it can be difficult to put into words. This is where rituals and artwork can make this dialect more manageable. Ayn Rand suggested that through the seductive recreation of reality, art brings man's concepts to the perceptual level of his consciousness and allows him to grasp them directly as if they were precepts. This concept is often referred to as mimesis, a representation or imitation of the real world in art and literature as a factor in social change. By using mimesis and open mode discovery through art practices, artists create work that encourages actual or internal dialogue among viewers to understand, remember, forget, record, or reconcile grief and mourning. Grief and mourning fluidly work together naturally in an open and closed mode thinking process to create a complete bereavement. Grief makes people ask themselves questions. Resilience may be thought of as one way trauma survivors or grievers start to answer these questions and access adaptive coping mechanisms to survive and even thrive in the face of adversity. Vicarious resilience is the concept that support people also gain improved skills and processes while caring and engaging with resilient survivors. In contemporary North American culture, mourners are encouraged to reach closure and fix the pain quickly so they can return to a state of normalcy. Feelings and emotions of loss are often avoided, creating closed-mode cultural norms surrounding death. The avoidance of bereavement is so great that even many seminaries do not actively teach bereavement to outgoing chaplains. Of course, after a loss, there is no original state of normalcy available, only change. Conflict involves pressure or anxiety. That includes loss and grief in some way. Research on trauma acknowledges that memories from trauma are distinct and are not the same as everyday memories. When conflicts continue over time or are categorized by physical or structural violence, the person's grieving can be a complex mixture of many compounding losses that can be entracted over generations. Those who suffer these complex losses live suspended between a past that is longed for and a future that is hoped for. Under pressure and anxiety, most people tend to maintain the tunnel vision closed mode provides, when what is really needed is to contemplate a wider open mode view. John Cleese states the main complaint about politicians from their non-political colleagues is that they have become addicted to reacting to events and have lost their ability to ponder problems. Like a pressure cooker with the flame turned up, this pent-up grief will eventually come flowing out in all sorts of potentially negative ways, resulting in compounding pain and harm. This can include physical illness, failing relationships, addictive behaviors, deep depression. Accordingly, closed-mode thinking alone in grief context may be completely ineffective. Incomplete open mode grieving issues switched into closed mode of operating too soon are transferred into the looping generational memory of these events, forever embedded with grief avoidance. The effects of grief avoidance are on display at places such as Wounded Knee, Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Vietnam, Twin Towers, Sandy Hook, and Ferguson. Sites that hold our attention not only as events, but also as continual grieving collective memory. Dr. Alan Wolfelt, a grief researcher, calls this phenomenon living in the shadow of the ghosts of grief. With these foundational concepts, I then took a highly personal and contextualized approach to my historical research. Through my art practice, the recording of mourning started when I was 8. My grandfather, who was my best friend, died unexpectedly. The adults around me were heartbroken at his unexpected death. Even in their shock and awkwardness, they had the forethought to provide me with magazines, glue, and scissors. I learned to be fully present in those sobering moments of youthful innocence about death and refused to lose my sense of wonder. During my youth, I was surrounded by storytellers. Political refugees carry one element consistently: their stories. These people are full of memories, mourning, and a hope for intellectual and narrative reasoning. Frequently their only mainstay. My maternal grandparents left Poland before World War II. Their daughter married into the Native American tribe, the Lenni Lenape. My parental side is mostly Irish and German immigrants who worked for labor rights. From them, their siblings and friends, I heard stories of loss, injustice, and resilience. They filled my life with a great amount of love and laughter, yet there always hovered a shadow of uncertainty and unpredictability. I learned vicariously from their actions and unspoken language about incompleteness within continual bereavement and how it differed from the dominant norm. I had no idea how these skills would serve me. Years later, over a 5-year period starting in 2005, my father, youngest brother, and mother died. These consecutive deaths gave a deeper awareness of a dominant, incomplete loss mechanism, leading me to further pursue how bereavement can be facilitated using visual methods and creative thought in mediation and dialogue with the viewer. Through the analysis of my personal narrative, Within historical events, I realized that my discomfort was not with grief and mourning, but with what I saw as the prevailing cultural norm of grief avoidance. Desiring deeper study on the subject, I entered the University of Oregon's Law School in the Conflict and Dispute Resolution program. First, I went looking for the origins of the dominant grief avoidant culture in North America, then analyzed how artists have contributed to healthier expressions of grief and mourning in the midst of some of the most terrible conflicts in modern memory, with a focus on the world wars. Museums have historically played an important part in the Eurocentric North American approach to grieving large collective events. How did the museum develop into this role? Part of the answer comes from the emergence of the collector in Western history, which in turn requires some understanding, strangely enough, of the bubonic plague. The plague was a recurring threat for more than 3 centuries, wiping out between 30 to 50% of the population. The plague carried with it the potential to cause enormous anxiety among the population, always followed by a search for desperate relief. Among other consequences, historians note that at this time began an obsession for collecting that became one of the hallmarks of humanism in most Eurocentric countries. An early version of the museum was the private collection, typically displayed in the houses of the wealthy and elite, often called wonder rooms, cabinets of curiosity, or the Wunderkammer. Objectifying the universe was an attempt to find a kind of order by making the invisible emotional grief visible through controllable intellectual means. A great example of this behavior is tulip mania. In the middle of the 16th century, within a year after the epidemic of the plague, this craze reached its height with a very rare Scepter Augustus bulb, valued roughly the equivalent of $2,000. These collectibles seem to be endowed with qualities and ritual that help in the dispelling of old self-doubts and fears of vulnerability, because they recede behind sentiments of pride and accomplishment through the collection or memorialization process, often at large consequences to minority cultures. These practices looted cultural and environmental property. They also became the basis of exclusive interpretation seen in contemporary museum and memorialization practices. Ethnologist Konrad Lorenz describes grief avoidance as a triumphant ceremony. Through this ceremony, the object is a strong component in the memorialization of trauma, grief, and mourning narratives in Western culture. It also perhaps tends to reassure people that they can avoid death itself. Dr. Wolfelt wrote in his 2003 book, Understanding Your Grief, "Our society, Western culture, has slowly converted into a grief-avoidant culture, a culture that attempts to think of death as optional." In the next section, I will focus on the artist's role in meeting the needs of mourning. For grief to heal well, it must be expressed through a shared mourning process or ritual. In the 3 art movements throughout the world wars, Dadaist, Constructionism, and Surrealism, there are strong examples that correlate with what Wolfelt describes as the 6 needs of mourners. Within Dada, Constructionism, and Surrealist movements, artists and writers were engaged as activists, advocates, and cultural mediators. Along with my research of these historical periods, I looked for mimesis examples to use in my own artwork. These movements entailed using both the open and closed mode thinking for reconciliation through innovation. Like the early collector, in my art and bereavement practice, I try to make sense in order of the universe through collected data and ephemera, in an effort to make mourning visible. I have constructed 15 pieces in my thesis. It started in an open mode of discovery. I collected images at random. Then I looked through the collected pieces in a closed mode method to curate how to illustrate unspeakable grief and emotions. This practice supplies a foundation for abstract and intellectual understanding of true self, place, and the direct experience of being human. At times, this is a substantial essence being covered over by social conditioning and anxiety surrounding grief. I see my artwork as a portal for the viewer to witness and experience this collection. Through this analysis and reflection, I hope looking at this work allows the conflict specialist to consider the unspoken and hidden part grief plays within conflicts in a prevailing cultural norm of grief avoidance. The two main artists' work I focused on through the closed mode process were Francis Goya and Christian Boltanski. Goya was a Spanish Romantic painter and printmaker. His work bridges both the last of the old masters and the first of the moderns. Witnessing the Neapolitan Wars and bloodshed, he creates a series of prints called The Disasters of War. He abandons the color of oil paint for a more direct truth found in the line, shadow, and shade of sepia-colored etchings. These images were never shown during his lifetime, but rediscovered at the beginning of World War I. While making these images, I often referred to the contemporary artwork of Christian Boltanski, a French sculptor, photographer, painter, and filmmaker. His work discusses the narrative of resilient survivors, collective and diminishing memory within the human condition, visually expressed through living and created reliquaries. He was born just after the liberation of Paris in 1944. Lenore reflects the brief moment of seeing the reality of a trauma spectacle and remembering she is made of grief or birds. Like in Poe's passage, the reality of grief is sensed, but when spoken seems to hide, disguised in an uncomfortable control, longing within a culture of avoidance. Largely in North America, the worst thing to do is cry uncontrollably after death. It brings with it the implied accepted norm to control not only emotions, but crying as well. In Polish and Lenape, there are no phrases to correspond with crying uncontrollably, because there is no community-shared assumption embedded in the language that people can be expected to want to control crying and emotion at a death. For Lenore, I looked at Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2 by Duchamp. Duchamp himself said his aim was a static representation of movement. Through Lenore, I have tried to show static grief. Palimpsestic memory is something that has changed over time and shows evidence of that change within time, space, history, and geography. This is what Walter Benjamin describes as constellations. Constellational events can also domino on one another. There are many accounts of the Nazis studying the U.S. treatment and policy of Native people for guidance in planning concentration camps. This image illustrates a constellational image repeated over and over, slightly misaligned. With each generation, the memory traces grow in action, but are never truly quite clear to the original narrative, leaving these memories never to be reconciled. These memories and grief avoidance halt the need in mourning, stuffing the feelings of pain from loss while remembering actually what happened is blurred in history. These images impacted palimpsestic memory image. On the left, you will see the Nazis standing before a mass grave of victims of the Jewish Holocaust. On the right, U.S. soldiers pose near a mass grave of Lakota Sioux following the Wounded Knee massacre on December 29, 1890. Below is Goya's Disasters of War, plate number 3, and then repeating image of Magritte's in his surrealism. The Gaze of the White Wolf. This is based on Freud's famous anxiety dream case study, The Wolfman. A Russian political refugee escaped to Germany during the Russian Revolution. He is haunted by a recurring dream of white wolves watching him. Contemporary scholar Alfred Lopez describes this as whiteness watching the dreamer, the dreamer's anxiety at finding himself under the intent gaze and implicit menace and judgment of that whiteness. In Germany at the time, there was a growing cultural logistics of nationalism and racial purity. This piece is dedicated to those that are missing or who have disappeared from the daily life under the intent gaze and implicit menace and judgment of whiteness and hegemonic power. These three images supported the Gaze of the White Wolf, the top one being Spellbound, where Dali, Freud, and Hitchcock come together. Also, that's a political cartoon right after World War I. And then Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday's cover. Imagine being born into a world in which something horrid has transpired in recent past, yet you have no understanding or correlation to these events that pervade your environment. At times, the story becomes so clear you can touch it, but then the reality of innocence blurs the unreality of horror. This image represents the blinded girl, Justice, first steps out of the long dark tunnel of grief avoidance. This image was inspired by Goya's The Disasters of War series, plate number 37, called This Is Worse. Goya witnessed in the aftermath of battle the mutilated torsos and limbs of civilian victims mounted into trees like fragments of marble sculptures. I also looked at two contemporary artists, both born in a couple years after World War II, Gottfried Heldewein and Ansel Kiefer. Like Boltanski, through their artwork, they tried to reconcile grief from events in recent past. With the notion of death and grief radically transformed after the World Wars, poet D. M. Thomas wrote, "The idea of mass anonymous death, the thought that so many people could be wiped out for no reason, in some ways threatened one's own sense of existence, one's own soul. By letting avoidance hold back grief, we allow mass anonymous death to have no reason, compromising our very own existence. Venus favors the bold, captures the ability to transcend grief into mourning. Looking at life and death in the reflective shield of artwork, we see our own reflection and survive with a new, true sense of self." Pieces that inspired Venus Favors the Bold is, of course, The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, St. Veronica, where she shows the true face of Christ, and The Last Audience with the Habsburgs. This small face is surrounded by pencil ghosts of her fellow war orphans. This painting was first exhibited in Eugene, Oregon over 50 years ago, after it was smuggled into the United States in a carpet roll by a political refugee. I just really felt that her looking out was something that the artists themselves had said, that there was a change happening from World War I to World War II. From what I have shown, that it is important for conflict specialists to broaden their understanding on the aspects of loss and grief in their work. I also encourage them to find, create, and provide opportunities for engagement and practice with open and closed mode methods of thinking and dispute resolution. What next is my next question. I have only concentrated on historical art periods in this project. This was purposeful in illustrating the beginning of grief avoidance. Yet there is a growing number of artists frustrated at the lack of artist voices included in the conversations in war zones and are advocating for this voice. This is an area for more investigation and participation. I encourage anyone who has any ability to help artists in these war zones to give them a space where they can express what's been happening. Many artists, writers, and critics believe that postmodernism is stuck, repeating the same looping narratives causing a vacuum. Because of this acknowledgement, it is important to suggest the Dadaists, the Constructionists, and the Surrealist movements may only be in reconciliation from about World War I to pre and middle World War II situations. This leaves the entire remaining events of World War II unresolved, avoided, and unreconciled. Richard Rorty has argued that if human beings are to develop an inclusive culture of human rights, it is the education of emotions that is needed. He often calls this sentimental education. A change in heart cannot be legislated. Grief avoidance leaves little room for peace building. Precisely the function of public memory discourse is to allow individuals to break out of traumatic repetitions. How ironic that the need to mourn is shoved away, the very thing that will alleviate it. It is not enough for artists and conflict specialists to engage solely in closed mode practices when serving as cultural mediators. I want to thank you for taking the time to look over this work and listen to my artist talk about this project. I hope you have gained some information on grief and mourning. Thank you.